The roommate. When Sarah got accepted into her dream university, she was thrilled. The campus was beautiful, her classes were interesting, and she was ready for the full college experience. However, when she arrived, she found out she had been assigned a roommate named Emily. Emily seemed nice enough at first, quiet, a bit shy, but polite. It wasn't long before Sarah started to notice some strange things. Emily had an odd habit of locking herself in their shared bathroom for hours. She would spend most of her time in there, whispering to herself, and if Sarah tried to ask her anything, Emily would just smile and brush it off. There was also the fact that Emily never seemed to sleep. Sarah would often wake up in the middle of the night to find Emily standing at the window, staring out into the darkness. One night, Sarah woke up to a strange noise. It was a soft scratching, like nails on wood. She looked over at Emily's bed, but found it empty. The scratching continued, and it seemed to be coming from the closet. With her heart pounding, Sarah slowly got out of bed and approached the closet door. She hesitated, hand hovering over the doorknob, before she finally gathered the courage to open it. Inside, she found Emily crouched on the floor, scratching at the walls with her fingers, mumbling incoherently. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with terror. When Emily noticed Sarah, she grabbed her by the wrist and hissed, "They're coming for me. They're always watching." Shaken, Sarah managed to pull away and ran out of the room. She spent the rest of the night in the lounge, too scared to return. The next morning, she went back to the room, but Emily was gone. Her bed was perfectly made, and there was no sign that anyone had ever been in the closet. Sarah reported Emily's strange behavior to the campus authorities, but they only shrugged it off, saying that Emily had probably just dropped out. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, she locked her door and pushed a chair against it. She barely slept, listening for any sign of movement outside. Around 3 a.m., she heard the sound of scratching again, this time coming from the door. Terrified, she covered her ears and waited for it to stop. The next morning, she packed her things and requested a room transfer. She never saw Emily again, but every once in a while, she would wake up in the middle of the night, certain she could hear faint scratching at her door. The haunting of room 313. In one of the older dorm buildings on campus, there was a room that had been closed off for years. Room 313 was infamous among the students. The story went that years ago, a girl named Lucy had lived there. Lucy was a bright, cheerful student who was well liked by everyone. But one night, she mysteriously disappeared. The police searched the entire campus, but she was never found. A few weeks after her disappearance, her roommate started noticing strange things in the room. Objects would move on their own, the temperature would drop suddenly, and at night she could hear faint whispers. The roommate grew increasingly paranoid and eventually left school altogether. Since then, no one had been assigned to room 313. Years later, a new student named Jason transferred to the university. The dorms were full, and the only available room was 313. The housing office reluctantly gave it to him, but not without warning him about the room's history. Jason, being a skeptic, laughed off the stories and moved in. The first few nights were uneventful. But on the third night, Jason woke up to the sound of a girl crying. He sat up in bed and listened. The crying was soft, almost mournful, and seemed to be coming from the closet. He turned on the light and cautiously approached the closet door. When he opened it, there was nothing inside, but the crying continued, echoing around the room. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. Jason would find his belongings scattered around the room, the temperature would drop to freezing levels, and every night, he would hear the crying. Desperate for answers, he started researching the history of room 313 and came across the story of Lucy. One night, determined to put an end to the haunting, Jason set up a video camera in his room. He went to bed, and as expected, the crying started again. This time, it was louder, more intense, and filled with despair. Jason forced himself to stay in bed, even as the temperature dropped and he could see his breath in the air. The next morning, he reviewed the footage. What he saw chilled him to the bone. In the video, as he lay in bed, a shadowy figure emerged from the closet. The figure was of a young girl with long, dark hair covering her face. She slowly made her way to the bed and stood over Jason, watching him sleep. Then she leaned down and whispered something in his ear before disappearing. Jason couldn't hear what she said on the recording, but he didn't need to. He already knew. That night, as he was lying in bed, unable to sleep, he heard her voice clearly in his mind. "Help me. They never found me." Terrified, Jason packed his things and left the room, never to return. Room 313 remains closed to this day, but some say if you walk by it late at night, you can still hear the faint sound of a girl crying. The ritual. Megan was excited to join her university's most prestigious sorority. The girls were beautiful, successful, and seemed to have everything together. When she received her invitation to join, she was over the moon. The initiation ceremony, they told her, was just a formality, something all new members had to go through. The night of the initiation, Megan and the other pledges were blindfolded and taken to an undisclosed location. When the blindfolds were removed, they'd found themselves in an old, abandoned building on the edge of campus. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the only light came from flickering candles placed in a circle on the floor. The sorority president, a tall, striking girl named Jessica, stood in the center of the circle. She explained that the initiation was a tradition passed down for generations. All they had to do was recite an oath and drink from the chalice in the center of the circle. As Megan recited the oath, she felt a strange sensation wash over her. It was as if the air around her had grown heavier, thicker. When it was her turn to drink from the chalice, she hesitated. The liquid inside was dark and had a metallic smell, but the other girls were watching her expectantly, so she forced herself to take a sip. Immediately, she felt a cold, creeping sensation spread through her body. Her vision blurred, and the room began to spin. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a whisper. The last thing she remembered before losing consciousness was the sight of Jessica smiling down at her, her eyes gleaming in the candlelight. When Megan woke up, she was back in her dorm room. She felt weak, disoriented, and there was a strange mark on her wrist, a symbol that matched the ones she had seen on the walls of the abandoned building. She tried to talk to the other pledges, but they all seemed different, distant, almost robotic. Over the next few days, Megan started experiencing terrifying hallucinations. She would see shadowy figures out of the corner of her eye, hear whispers that no one else could hear, and wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was watching her. Desperate, she confronted Jessica, demanding to know what had happened during the initiation. Jessica just smiled and said, "You're one of us now. There's no going back." Megan started researching the sorority's history and discovered that it had ties to ancient occult practices. The initiation ritual was a way to bind the new members to an ancient entity that the sorority worshipped. The mark on her wrist was a sign that she was now connected to this entity, and there was no way to break the bond. Terrified and alone, Megan tried to leave the university, but every time she attempted to pack her things, something would stop her, her car wouldn't start, her train tickets would disappear, and she would receive threatening messages from the other sorority members. One night, as she was lying in bed, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She turned to see a shadowy figure standing over her. The figure leaned down and whispered, "You belong to us now." Megan screamed, but no one heard her. The next morning, her roommate found her bed empty, her belongings gone, and a single message written in blood on the wall: "She is ours." To this day, Megan's disappearance remains a mystery. The sorority continues to recruit new members, and the initiation ritual is still carried out every year. But some say that if you listen closely during the ceremony, you can hear Megan's voice, crying out for help from the other side. The study group. During finals week, Emily, Jake, and their friends decided to pull an all-nighter in the university library. They had a big group project due the next day and needed to get it done. The library was open 24 hours during finals, so they figured it would be the perfect place to work without any distractions. They set up camp in a secluded corner of the library, surrounded by stacks of books. The night started off well enough. They were making progress on their project, and the atmosphere was almost cozy with the dim lights and the quiet rustling of pages. But as the night wore on, strange things started happening. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped suddenly. They brushed it off as the building's old electrical system acting up, but then they started hearing noises. At first, it was just the sound of books falling off shelves in the distance. Then they'd heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty aisles. Jake decided to investigate, thinking it was just another student. He walked down the darkened aisles, calling out, but no one answered. As he turned the corner, he saw a figure standing at the end of the aisle. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing an old-fashioned suit. His face was obscured by shadows, but Jake could feel his eyes watching him. Jake backed away, but the figure didn't move. He returned to the study group, visibly shaken, and told them what he saw. They'd all laughed it off, saying he was just tired and imagining things. But then the noises grew louder. The sound of footsteps, whispers, and books falling echoed through the library. Emily started to feel uneasy. She glanced at the clock. It was almost 3 a.m. They decided to call it a night and pack up their things. But as they made their way to the exit, they realized the door wouldn't open. They were locked in. Panic set in as they tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The lights flickered again, and they heard the footsteps, this time closer, almost as if they were right behind them. Emily turned around and saw the figure standing at the end of the aisle, closer than before. They ran, weaving through the darkened aisles, trying to find another way out. But no matter which way they turned, the figure seemed to be following them, always just out of reach. They could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the library. Finally, they found a side door that led to a stairwell. They rushed down the stairs, their footsteps echoing loudly in the confined space, but as they reached the bottom, they found the door locked. Desperation set in as they pounded on the door, hoping someone would hear them. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The library was deathly silent. Emily turned around, and the figure was gone. They waited, hearts pounding, but the figure didn't reappear. Finally, they heard the sound of the main door unlocking. They ran out of the library, not daring to look back. When they reached the safety of the dorms, they realized they had left all their belongings behind. But none of them cared. They just wanted to get as far away from the library as possible. The next day, they went back to the library to retrieve their things. But when they asked the librarian about the figure, she just gave them a puzzled look. No one else was in the library last night, she said. The security cameras didn't show anyone. To this day, they never found out who or what was stalking them in the library that night. But they never stayed in the library after dark again. The disappearing floor. Carla had always heard rumors about the old science building on campus, but she never paid much attention to them. It was said that the 3rd floor of the building had been closed off years ago due to a tragic accident, and that anyone who ventured up there would never return. The building was old and decrepit, with flickering lights and peeling paint, but it was still used for some classes, just not the 3rd floor. One evening, Carla found herself in the building after hours, working on a lab report that was due the next day. She was one of the last students left, and as the night wore on, she realized she was completely alone. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights above. As she worked, she heard a soft creaking noise coming from the hallway. She tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, like footsteps echoing down the corridor. Curiosity got the better of her, and she peeked out of the lab door. The hallway was empty, but the sound continued, now accompanied by a faint whispering. Against her better judgment, Carla followed the sound. It led her to the old staircase that had been roped off for years. The whispers seemed to be coming from above, beckoning her to climb. She hesitated for a moment, then ducked under the rope and ascended the stairs. The 3rd floor was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under her weight. The whispering grew louder, but she still couldn't make out the words. As she walked down the hallway, she noticed that the doors to the old classrooms were slightly ajar, as if someone had been there recently. She pushed open one of the doors and stepped inside. The room was filled with old desks and chairs, all covered in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room was a single large desk on which lay an old notebook. Carla approached it cautiously and opened it. The pages were filled with notes and drawings, all in a language she couldn't understand. The writing was erratic, almost frantic, and the drawings were of strange symbols and figures. As she flipped through the pages, the whispering grew louder, more urgent. She realized that the whispers were coming from the notebook itself. Panicked, she dropped the notebook and backed away, but as she turned to leave, she saw that the door was closed. She hadn't had it shut behind her. Suddenly, the room grew cold. and the whispering turned into a low, guttural growl. The lights flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist. Carla tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. She pounded on it, screaming for help, but no sound came out. The growling grew louder, and the shadows in the room began to coalesce into a dark, hulking figure. It had no face, just a void where its features should have been, but she could feel its eyes on her, burning into her soul. The figure reached out with long, shadowy arms, and Carla felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. In a desperate attempt to escape, she turned and ran toward the windows, but they were sealed shut. The figure loomed closer, its presence suffocating, and Carla felt her strength leaving her. She collapsed to the floor, her vision growing dark, and the last thing she heard before everything went black was the sound of the figure whispering her name. The next morning, the janitor found the door to the third-floor classroom open, but there was no sign of Carla. Her belongings were still in the lab downstairs, but she was never seen again. The notebook she found was gone too, and no one has dared to venture to the third floor since. Some say that Carla is still up there, trapped in the old science building, and that if you listen closely, you can hear her whispering for help from the shadows. The Phantom Professor. Professor Harrison was one of the most respected faculty members at the university. He had been teaching there for over 30 years, and his classes were always full. He was known for his strict demeanor, his meticulous lectures, and his obsession with perfection. But there was something else that made him stand out, something that the students only whispered about behind his back. They said that Professor Harrison never aged. Photos of him from decades ago looked exactly like he did today, same gray hair, same sharp eyes, same stern expression. Some said he was a vampire, others thought he had made a pact with the devil, but no one knew for sure. One semester, a group of students decided to investigate the rumors. They were all seniors, taking their final course with Professor Harrison, and they were determined to uncover the truth. The group included Alex, a journalism major with a knack for digging up dirt; Lily, a psychology major fascinated by the human mind; and James, a history major with a passion for solving mysteries. They started by looking into the university's archives, digging up old records, and interviewing former students. They found out that Professor Harrison had indeed been teaching at the university for much longer than any normal human should. Old yearbooks showed him in faculty photos from the 1950s, and his name appeared on course rosters as far back as the 1920s. The more they dug, the more unsettling things became. They discovered that every few years, a student would disappear under mysterious circumstances, and those disappearances always seemed to be linked to Professor Harrison's classes. The students were often described as being particularly bright, standing out in their academic performance, just like Alex, Lily, and James. Determined to get to the bottom of it, they decided to confront Professor Harrison. They waited until after one of his late-night lectures, following him to his office in the oldest part of the university building. The hallways were dark and deserted, and as they approached his office, they noticed that the lights were flickering. They knocked on the door, and it creaked open on its own. Inside, Professor Harrison sat at his desk, but something was different about him. His normally sharp eyes were glazed over, and his skin had a sickly pallor. The room was filled with a strange, oppressive energy, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. "Come in," he said, his voice sounding hollow, almost inhuman. The students hesitated, but Alex, emboldened by their research, stepped forward. "We know what you've been doing, Professor. We know about the students who disappeared, about how you've been here for decades without aging." Professor Harrison smiled, but it was a cold, empty smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And what exactly do you think you know, Mr. Thompson?" "We know that you're not human," Lally said, her voice trembling. "That you've been using students, sacrificing them, to stay alive." The professor's smile widened, and the lights in the room flickered ominously. "Is that what you think? That I'm some kind of monster, feeding off the lives of my students?" Before they could respond, the door behind them slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. The only light came from the professor's eyes, which now glowed with an unnatural, malevolent light. "You should have left well enough alone," he hissed. "But now you've forced my hand." The students tried to back away, but the door was locked. The room began to spin, and they'd felt an overwhelming sense of fear and dread. The walls seemed to close in around them, and they heard the faint sound of whispers, voices of the students who had disappeared before them. The last thing they saw was Professor Harrison standing over them, his eyes burning with an ancient evil power. The room went black, and the students' screams echoed through the empty hallways. The next morning, the university was in an uproar. Alex, Lily, and James were missing, and their disappearance was the talk of the campus. Professor Harrison continued teaching as if nothing had happened, his lectures as precise and meticulous as ever. But the students in his classes couldn't help but notice that his eyes seemed a little sharper, his skin a little more youthful. And those who looked closely at the old yearbook photos in the library would notice something even more chilling. The faces of Alex, Lily, and James now appeared in the background of the photos, their eyes filled with terror, forever trapped in the university's dark history. The ghost in the frat house. The Delta Theta Psi fraternity was known for its wild parties and rowdy members. It was the most popular frat on campus, but it also had a dark secret. Years ago, a pledge named Tom had died during a hazing ritual gone wrong. The fraternity had covered up the incident, and the members involved were long gone, but rumors persisted that Tom's spirit still haunted the house. New members of Delta Theta Psi were always warned about Tom's ghost. They were told to never go into the basement alone, to avoid the old attic, and to leave an offering of whiskey in the common room every week to appease him. Most of the guys thought it was just a way to scare the pledges, a tradition passed down through the years, but some of the older members swore they had seen Tom's ghost. One year, during Pledge Week, a group of new members decided to test the legend. They were skeptical of the ghost stories and wanted to prove that it was all just a myth. The leader of the group, Ryan, was particularly eager to show off his bravery. He suggested they hold the seance in the attic, the most haunted part of the house, to summon Tom's spirit. The other pledges were hesitant, but Ryan convinced them to go along with it. They gathered in the attic late at night, bringing a Ouija board, candles, and the traditional offering of whiskey. The attic was cold and dusty, filled with old furniture and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. The atmosphere was heavy, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. They lit the candles, placed the whiskey in the center of the circle, and began the seance. At first, nothing happened. The Ouija board remained still, and the only sounds were the creaking of the old house and the wind outside. But as they continued, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and the candles began to flicker. "Tom, are you here?" Ryan asked, his voice steady but with a hint of nervousness. The planchette on the Ouija board moved slowly to yes. The group exchanged nervous glances, but Ryan pressed on. "Tom, can you give us a sign?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, the attic door slammed shut, and the candles were snuffed out, plunging the room into darkness. The pledges jumped, their hearts racing. They fumbled for their phones to turn on the flashlight, but before they could, they heard a low, moaning sound coming from the corner of the attic. Ryan pointed his phone's light toward the sound, and what they saw made their blood run cold. In the corner of the room stood a figure, pale and translucent, with hollow eyes and a twisted expression of pain on its face. It was Tom. The ghost began to move toward them, its footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. The pledges were frozen in place, too terrified to move. As the ghost drew closer, the air around them grew colder, and they could feel an overwhelming sense of dread. Tom's ghost stopped just a few feet away from them, and the pledges could see the details of his tortured face, the bruises, the cuts, the terror in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, just a hollow, raspy sound. Suddenly, the whiskey bottle in the center of the circle shattered, and the ghost let out a blood-curdling scream. The sound was so loud and piercing that the pledges clapped their hands over their ears. The walls of the attic shook, and the windows rattled violently. The ghost reached out toward them, its fingers long and skeletal, but before it could touch them, it vanished. The attic door flew open, and the pledges didn't waste a second. They bolted down the stairs, not stopping until they were out of the house and on the street. They didn't speak of what happened to anyone, and from that night on, they never went near the attic again. The next day, the fraternity president found the attic in disarray. The furniture was overturned, the walls were scratched and gouged as if by sharp claws, and the floor was covered in broken glass. The whiskey bottle had been shattered into 100 pieces, and the air still smelled faintly of alcohol and something else, something rotten. The president knew what had happened. He gathered the pledges and warned them never to mess with Tom's ghost again. They were to respect the traditions, leave the offerings, and stay away from the attic. The pledges agreed, too terrified to argue. From then on, the ghost of Tom was never disturbed again, but every new group of pledges was told the story of what had happened that night. And every year, on the anniversary of his death, the fraternity members would hear strange noises coming from the attic, footsteps, whispers, and the faint sound of a bottle breaking. The roommate that never left. Sarah was thrilled when she got her dorm assignment at college. The room was spacious, and her roommate, Kate, seemed like a perfect match. Friendly, easygoing, and tidy. They quickly became close, sharing everything from late-night snacks to deep conversations about their lives. A few weeks into the semester, Sarah started noticing strange things happening in their room. She would come back from class to find her belongings moved around, her bed made differently than how she left it, and sometimes even her textbooks opened to pages she hadn't been reading. At first, she thought it was Kate, but her roommate always seemed just as confused as she was. One night, Sarah was studying late in the library, and by the time she got back to her room, it was past midnight. She quietly unlocked the door, trying not to wake Kate. But when she walked in, she saw something that made her freeze in her tracks. Kate was sitting on the bed, but there was something off about her. She was staring blankly at the wall, her eyes wide open and unblinking. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hair hung limply around her face. Sarah called her name, but Kate didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Sarah slowly approached her, her heart pounding in her chest. As she got closer, she noticed that Kate wasn't breathing. Panic set in, and Sarah reached out to shake her roommate, but as soon as she touched her, Kate's body slumped to the side, collapsing lifelessly onto the bed. Sarah screamed and ran out of the room, her mind racing. She frantically called campus security, and within minutes, officers and paramedics were there. They rushed into the room, but when they emerged, they had puzzled expressions on their faces. "There's no one in there," one of the officers said. Sarah couldn't believe it. She knew what she had seen. She insisted that they search the room again, but they found nothing, no trace of Kate, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Her belongings were gone, and the bed was perfectly made, as if no one had ever slept in it. The next morning, Sarah went to the housing office to ask about Kate, but when the staff checked their records, they told her something that made her blood run cold. "There's no Kate assigned to that room," they said. "You've been listed as having a single room since the beginning of the semester." Sarah was stunned. She had lived with Kate for weeks, talked with her, shared meals with her, laughed with her. But according to the records, Kate didn't exist. Determined to find out the truth, Sarah started asking around campus, talking to anyone who might know something. She eventually found an old newspaper article about a student named Kate who had lived in her dorm years ago. Kate had died in a tragic accident. She fell from the window of her dorm room under mysterious circumstances. Some said it was an accident, others whispered it was a suicide, but no one knew for sure. Sarah realized that she had been living with a ghost. Kate's spirit had never left the room, and she had somehow latched onto Sarah, pretending to be her roommate. The thought was terrifying, but also heartbreaking. Kate had been alone, stuck between worlds, and Sarah had been the only one who had noticed her. After that, Sarah couldn't stay in the dorm. She requested a room change and moved to another building. But she couldn't forget Kate, the lonely ghost who had been her roommate. Sometimes, late at night, she would think she heard whispers in the hall, or see a shadow out of the corner of her eye, and she would wonder if Kate was still looking for someone to talk to, someone who would notice her. The night of the abandoned tunnel. Beneath the university, there was a network of old service tunnels that had long been abandoned. They were originally used to connect different buildings on campus, but over the years, they had fallen into disrepair and were eventually sealed off. Most students didn't even know they existed, but for those who did, the tunnels were the stuff of legend. One night, a group of friends, Mike, Jenny, Sam, and Laura, decided to explore the tunnels. They had heard stories about them, about how they were haunted by the spirits of workers who had died during construction, or how they led to secret rooms and forgotten parts of the campus. It was all just an adventure to them, something thrilling to do on a boring Saturday night. They found a way into the tunnels through a maintenance hatch behind one of the older buildings. Armed with flashlights and a rough map they had found online, they descended into the darkness. The air was damp and musty, and the walls were covered in graffiti and mold. The tunnel stretched out before them, long and winding, with side passages branching off into the unknown. At first, the group was excited, laughing and joking as they made their way deeper into the tunnels. But as they walked, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, and the silence became oppressive. The only sounds were the echo of their footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. After what felt like hours of walking, they came across a large rusted door. It was half open, revealing a dark room beyond. Curious, they decided to check it out. Inside, they'd found what looked like an old storage room. There were broken chairs, rusty tools, and piles of old papers scattered across the floor. But as they searched the room, they began to hear strange noises, whispers, shuffling footsteps, and faint, eerie laughter. At first, they thought it was just the echoes playing tricks on them, but then the noises grew louder, closer. The door suddenly slammed shut behind them, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as they tried to open the door, but it was stuck. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and they could feel a cold breeze brushing past them, as if something or someone was moving through the room. Jenny shone her flashlight around, and they saw shadows flickering on the walls, shadows that didn't belong to them. The temperature in the room plummeted, and their breath came out in visible puffs. The whispers turned into voices, low and malevolent, speaking in a language they couldn't understand. Then, one by one, their flashlights started to flicker and die. The darkness closed in, and the voices became louder, more frenzied. It felt like the walls were closing in, like something was trying to trap them. In a last-ditch effort, Mike threw himself against the door, and with a loud creak, it burst open. The group stumbled out into the tunnel, their hearts racing. They didn't stop running until they reached the exit, the sound of whispers still echoing in their ears. When they finally emerged from the tunnels, they were shaken and disoriented. They couldn't explain what had happened, and they didn't want to talk about it. They swore never to go back, and they told no one about their experience. But after that night, strange things began to happen. Mike started having nightmares about the tunnels, dreams where he was trapped in the darkness, with something just out of sight, whispering his name. Jenny found strange symbols carved into her dorm room door, symbols that looked like the ones they had seen in the tunnel. Sam started hearing whispers in the middle of the night, and Laura felt like she was being watched, even when she was alone. The tunnels had left their mark on them, and they knew they had disturbed something that should have been left alone. The university eventually sealed off the entrance they had used, but the friends never felt safe again. The darkness of the tunnels seemed to follow them, and they could never shake the feeling that something was waiting for them, biding its time in the forgotten depths beneath the campus. The Bell Tower's curse. The old bell tower at the center of campus had stood there for over a century. It was a beautiful piece of architecture, with intricate stone carvings and a large, imposing bell that rang out every hour. But it was also a place with a dark history, a history that the university tried to keep quiet. Years ago, a student named Evelyn had fallen to her death from the bell tower under mysterious circumstances. Some said it was an accident, others believed it was a suicide, but there were those who whispered that she had been pushed by something unseen, something evil that dwelled in the tower. Since Evelyn's death, the bell tower was rumored to be cursed. Students who ventured up there alone often reported strange occurrences, unexplained cold spots, the sound of footsteps when no one was around, and even sightings of a ghostly figure on the staircase. But the most disturbing thing was the legend that if you heard the bell toll at midnight when you were inside the tower, you would be doomed to die within a year. One night, a group of friends, Mark, Emma, Lisa, and Josh, decided to test the legend. It was Halloween, and the campus was buzzing with spooky stories and haunted house parties. The group, fueled by alcohol and a sense of bravado, made a bet to see who could last the longest in the bell tower alone. They climbed the winding staircase, the old wooden steps creaking under their weight. The air grew colder as they ascended, and the atmosphere became heavier, more oppressive. By the time they reached the top, they were all feeling uneasy, but none of them wanted to back out. Mark went first, staying in the tower while the others waited at the bottom. The minutes ticked by slowly. The haunting of Dorm 13. Dorm 13 had always been the subject of whispers and rumors among students. It was an old building with creaky floors and a long history that went back more than a century. The tales surrounding it ranged from tragic accidents to sinister occurrences, but the most unsettling was the story of the girl who disappeared. It was said that many years ago, a student named Lily had vanished from her dorm room without a trace. Her disappearance was never solved, and the case went cold. Since then, students who moved into Dorm 13 reported strange phenomena: lights flickering on and off, cold spots in the middle of the room, and the feeling of being watched. When Jenna, a sophomore, moved into Dorm 13, she was aware of the stories but chose to ignore them. She was focused on her studies and was determined not to let any superstitions interfere with her college experience. Her roommate, Emily, was equally unfazed, and the two of them settled into their new home without incident. That is, until the first night. Jenna was woken by a soft whispering sound. She sat up in bed, trying to listen, but it was too faint to make out. She shrugged it off as the creaks of the old building and went back to sleep. But the whispers grew louder each night, until they became distinct voices speaking in hurried, anxious tones. One evening, after another restless night, Jenna decided to investigate. She went to the building's old archives, where she found some old records and photographs of the dorm. In one of the photos, she saw Lily. Her face was familiar, with a hauntingly sad expression. Next to the photo was a note about her disappearance, and Jenna read about the case with growing horror. It seemed Lily had been involved in a mysterious event involving other students, which had led to her vanishing. Determined to understand what was happening, Jenna started keeping a journal of the strange occurrences. She noticed patterns. The whispers were always accompanied by sudden drops in temperature, and the lights flickering seemed to coincide with specific times during the night. One night, the lights went out entirely, and Jenna felt a cold hand on her shoulder. Panicked, she turned around but found no one there. The whispers grew louder, almost as if they were trying to communicate something. Jenna could make out a few words: "Help me, lost, and find the truth." Jenna tried to talk to Emily about it, but Emily was skeptical and thought Jenna was just stressed. However, when Emily started experiencing the same disturbances, she became more open to the idea of something supernatural happening. One night, Jenna and Emily decided to conduct a seance in their room, hoping to communicate with the spirit. They set up candles and a makeshift Ouija board, and as they began to ask questions, the planchette moved on its own. The messages were fragmented but revealed a story of betrayal and fear. It became clear that Lily had been trying to reveal something important before she disappeared. The next morning, Jenna and Emily decided to investigate further. They discovered that the building's history was marred by a series of tragic events involving former students and faculty. It seemed that Lily had been the victim of a cover-up, and her spirit was trapped, unable to find peace. They decided to make their findings public, and with the help of a local historian, they were able to bring attention to the building's dark past. The story of Lily's disappearance was finally acknowledged, and the university began to investigate the claims more thoroughly. The hauntings in Dorm 13 gradually subsided after the truth was brought to light. Jenna and Emily moved out at the end of the semester, but they would always remember their time in Dorm 13 and the restless spirit they had encountered. Some students still reported occasional strange occurrences, but the sense of malevolence seemed to have faded, replaced by a lingering sadness. The unseen room. At the university's oldest library, there was a room that no one knew about, a hidden chamber that existed on no map and was never mentioned in any official records. The room was said to be a place of forgotten knowledge, its existence known only to a select few. Rachel, an archaeology major, was fascinated by the history of the library. She had heard rumors about the hidden room from her professors and classmates, but no one seemed to know where it was. Determined to find it, she began researching the library's architecture and old blueprints. Late one night, Rachel was alone in the library, poring over ancient documents in the dim light of a desk lamp. She had discovered a clue in one of the old manuscripts, a reference to a hidden door behind a wall of books. Following the clue, she began to search the library for the elusive door. After hours of searching, she found a section of the wall that seemed slightly out of place. It was covered with dusty old books, and when she pulled a few of them out, she noticed a faint outline of a door hidden behind them. With great effort, she managed to open the concealed door, revealing a narrow, winding staircase leading down into darkness. Rachel descended the stairs, her flashlight cutting through the pitch-black air. The staircase led to a small, ancient-looking room lined with shelves full of old, dusty books and manuscripts. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and age. The room seemed to be a library of forgotten knowledge, filled with tomes that had been lost to time. As she explored the room, she found a strange book resting on a pedestal in the center. The book was bound in leather and had a title written in a language she couldn't recognize. When she opened it, she was confronted with cryptic symbols and unsettling drawings of shadowy figures. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, and Rachel felt a cold breeze on her neck. She turned around to see shadowy figures flickering at the edges of her vision. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, forming vague, menacing shapes. Rachel's flashlight began to flicker, and the shadows grew more pronounced. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the room itself was alive and hostile. The whispers began, soft and disembodied, filling the air with an unintelligible murmur. She tried to leave, but the door she had come through was now closed tight, as if it had never existed. Panic set in as she searched for another way out, but the shadows seemed to close in on her, their whispers growing louder and more insistent. In her desperation, Rachel grabbed the strange book and attempted to break down the door. As she struck the door with all her might, the shadows coalesced into a dark, looming figure. It had no face, only an amorphous void where its features should have been. The figure reached out with long, shadowy hands, and Rachel felt its icy grip. The door finally gave way, and Rachel stumbled out of the hidden room, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran up the stairs and out of the library, leaving the strange book behind. She never returned to the library after that night. The following morning, the hidden room was gone. The door and the staircase had vanished, leaving no trace of their existence. The library staff were baffled by Rachel's claims, and there was no evidence of the room she described. Some say that the room only appears to those who are meant to find it, and that it holds knowledge too dangerous for ordinary people to understand. Rachel graduated and left the university, but she never forgot the night she encountered the unseen room. She always wondered if the shadows she had seen were merely figments of her imagination, or if they were something far more sinister. The echoes of the observatory. The university's old observatory was a beloved relic of the past, with its massive telescope and vintage equipment. It had been used by generations of students and professors to study the stars and explore the mysteries of the universe. But there was a dark side to its history that most students were unaware of. Years ago, a renowned astronomer named Dr. Richard Caldwell had worked at the observatory. He was known for his groundbreaking research, but he was also known for his obsession with a particular celestial phenomenon, a rare and mysterious star that he believed held the key to unlocking the secrets of the universe. Dr. Caldwell's obsession grew darker over time. He spent countless nights in the observatory, alone, studying the star through the telescope. He became increasingly isolated and erratic, and his colleagues began to worry about him. One night, he vanished without a trace, leaving behind his research and a series of frantic notes about the star. After his disappearance, the observatory fell into disrepair. The telescope was left abandoned, and the equipment was neglected. The building became a place of strange occurrences. Students reported hearing strange noises, seeing unexplained lights in the sky, and feeling an eerie presence. One evening, a group of astronomy students, Lucas, Maria, and Alex, decided to spend the night at the observatory. They wanted to experience the thrill of working with the old equipment and maybe catch a glimpse of something extraordinary. They set up their equipment and prepared to stargaze, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the night went on, they began to notice strange things. The telescope moved on its own, pointing to different parts of the sky even though they hadn't touched it. The temperature in the observatory dropped suddenly, and they heard a low, echoing hum that seemed to come from nowhere. Lucas, curious about the old research, found Dr. Caldwell's notes scattered on a desk. The notes were filled with frantic scribbles and complex equations, all centered around the mysterious star. One note, in particular, caught Lucas's eye. It was a warning about the dangers of staring too long at the star. The group decided to use the telescope to observe the star, thinking it would be a fitting tribute to Dr. Caldwell. As they peered through the lens, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The star appeared to be pulsating, its light growing brighter and more intense with each passing moment. It was as if the star was alive, sending out waves of energy that seemed to reach out into the darkness. Suddenly, the observatory's lights flickered and the hum grew louder. The students felt a strange sensation, as if they were being pulled toward the star. Shadows danced on the walls, and they heard whispers in a language they couldn't understand. The temperature dropped even further, and their breaths were visible in the frigid air. The telescope's lens began to fog up, and the students saw a figure in the star's light, an ethereal, ghostly form that seemed to be reaching out to them. The figure's eyes were hollow, and its expression was one of intense longing and despair. Panic set in, and the students scrambled to turn off the telescope and leave the observatory. But as they tried to exit, the doors slammed shut, trapping them inside. The hum grew louder, and the shadows seemed to close in around them. In a desperate attempt to escape, they broke a window and climbed out onto the roof. They ran down the stairs and out of the building, their hearts racing and their minds filled with fear. They didn't stop until they were far away from the observatory. The next day, the observatory was found in perfect condition, no signs of the strange occurrences or disturbances. The telescope was still and silent, and there was no trace of the shadows or whispers. The students' accounts were dismissed as a trick of the mind, and the observatory continued to be a place of fascination and study. But Lucas, Maria, and Alex never returned to the observatory. They couldn't shake the feeling that they had encountered something far beyond their understanding, a force that was connected to the star and the lost astronomer who had become consumed by its mysteries. The echoes of the observatory's dark past lingered in their memories, a haunting reminder of the unknown dangers that lay hidden among the stars. The professor's secret. Dr. Maxwell was one of the most esteemed professors at the university, known for his groundbreaking research in psychology. His lectures were always packed, and his students revered him for his brilliant mind and enigmatic charisma. But behind his polished exterior, Dr. Maxwell harbored a dark secret. Legend had it that Dr. Maxwell conducted experiments on his students, using unconventional and unethical methods to test the limits of the human psyche. His research involved manipulating fear and hallucinations, pushing the boundaries of psychological stress. Some said he had even been involved in mysterious disappearances of students who had participated in his experiments. When Emily, a psychology major, was assigned to work on a research project under Dr. Maxwell, she was thrilled. She'd admired his work and hoped to gain invaluable experience. However, as she started working closely with him, she noticed strange things happening in his lab. Unexplained equipment malfunctions, odd noises, and unsettling shifts in the atmosphere. One night, while working late in the lab, Emily stumbled upon a hidden room behind a bookcase. Curiosity got the better of her, and she ventured inside. The room was filled with old, dusty files and strange equipment, machines that looked like they belonged in a bygone era of psychological experiments. As Emily sifted through the files, she found documents detailing horrific experiments, accounts of students subjected to extreme psychological stress, forced to confront their deepest fears in a controlled setting. Some of the documents mentioned subjects who had disappeared, their fates unknown. There were also disturbing notes about perfecting the fear response and maximizing trauma. Emily's heart raced as she realized the gravity of what she had uncovered. She knew she had to confront Dr. Maxwell, but when she tried to speak to him about the files, he became defensive and evasive. His demeanor changed drastically, and Emily sensed an underlying menace in his behavior. Desperate to expose the truth, Emily decided to gather evidence and go to the authorities. But as she was leaving the lab one night with a stack of incriminating documents, she felt a presence behind her. Turning around, she saw Dr. Maxwell standing in the shadows, his eyes dark and intense. "You shouldn't have looked," he said in a cold, menacing tone. "You don't understand what you've stumbled upon." Emily tried to run, but the lights in the hallway flickered and went out. The darkness seemed to close in around her, and she heard whispers echoing through the corridors. She felt hands grasping at her, pulling her back toward the lab. With a surge of adrenaline, Emily escaped the building and went straight to the authorities. She provided them with the evidence she had gathered, and an investigation was launched. Dr. Maxwell was placed on administrative leave pending further inquiry, and the university conducted a thorough review of his research practices. As the investigation unfolded, more disturbing details emerged. It was revealed that Dr. Maxwell had been conducting unauthorized experiments on students for years, with many of his subjects suffering severe psychological trauma. The university took swift action to address the issues, and Dr. Maxwell's career came to an abrupt and disgraceful end. Emily transferred to a different university, but the experience left her deeply shaken. She couldn't escape the feeling that Dr. Maxwell's influence had left a lasting impact on her, and she struggled with recurring nightmares and anxiety. The memory of that dark, hidden room haunted her, a reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind even the most esteemed facades. The Forgotten Fraternity. In the outskirts of campus, there was an old, abandoned fraternity house that had been neglected for decades. The house was large and imposing, with ivy creeping up its walls and broken windows that looked like empty eyes staring out into the night. Students often told ghost stories about the house, claiming it was haunted by the spirits of its former residents. One of the most chilling stories was about a group of fraternity brothers who had disappeared without a trace one night. The brothers were known for their wild parties and secret rituals, and their sudden disappearance was never fully explained. The fraternity was disbanded, and the house was left to decay. When Ryan, a senior, and his friends, Tom, Laura, and Jess, heard about the house, they were intrigued. They had heard the rumors and wanted to see if the stories were true. Despite the warnings from other students, they decided to explore the abandoned house one night. They arrived at the house just after dusk, armed with flashlights and a camera to document their adventure. As they entered, the floorboards creaked ominously beneath their feet, and the air inside was musty and stale. The walls were covered in old, faded fraternity banners, and the furniture was covered in layers of dust. The group began to explore the house, each room revealing more of its neglected state. They found old photographs of the fraternity brothers, their faces frozen in smiles that seemed oddly unsettling. The deeper they went, the more the house seemed to come alive with strange noises, whispers, footsteps, and the distant sound of a piano playing a mournful tune. When they reached the basement, they'd found a hidden door behind a rotting bookcase. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The group hesitated but decided to continue. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a small room filled with strange symbols painted on the walls and a large ornate mirror standing against one side. As they examined the room, Jess noticed that the mirror was oddly reflective, showing not just their own images, but also something else. Shadowy figures moving in the background, their shapes shifting and swirling. The figures seemed to reach out toward them, their movements erratic and frightening. Suddenly, the room grew cold, and the shadows in the mirror became more defined. The air was filled with a low, rumbling sound, and the symbols on the walls seemed to glow with an eerie light. The group felt a powerful sense of dread, and they could hear muffled voices whispering in a language they didn't understand. In a panic, Ryan grabbed the mirror and tried to move it, but as he did, the room began to shake. The shadows grew more intense, and the voices became louder, their tone increasingly aggressive. The group tried to leave, but the stairs seemed to have vanished, replaced by a solid wall of darkness. With a final burst of adrenaline, they managed to break a window and climb out, escaping the house as it seemed to close in around them. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of the streetlights outside. The next day, the group tried to make sense of what they had experienced, but no one believed their story. The fraternity house remained abandoned, and the university eventually began to consider it a site of local legends and superstitions. The group never spoke of their experience to anyone outside their circle, and they avoided the house from then on. Ryan and his friends never forgot the night they'd ventured into the forgotten fraternity house. The sight of the shadowy figures in the mirror and the feeling of being trapped in darkness haunted their dreams, a chilling reminder of the sinister history that lay hidden within the decaying walls. The enigmatic sculpture. The campus art gallery was known for its impressive collection of contemporary and classic artworks. However, there was one piece that stood out, a mysterious sculpture that had been donated anonymously many years ago. The sculpture was a tall, abstract figure with twisted, contorted forms and an unsettling, almost grotesque quality. It was displayed in a dimly lit corner of the gallery where few students ventured. No one knew much about the sculpture's origins, but it was said to be cursed. The legend went that anyone who spent too much time in its presence would be plagued by nightmares and strange occurrences. Some students claimed to have seen the sculpture move or change shape when they weren't looking. One evening, Alex, a curious art history student, decided to investigate the sculpture. He had heard the rumors and wanted to see if there was any truth to them. As he stayed late in the gallery, examining the sculpture closely, he noticed that the shadows it cast seemed to shift and change, forming eerie shapes on the walls. As the hours passed, Alex began to feel an odd sense of unease. The gallery was quiet, and the air seemed to grow colder. The sculpture's twisted forms appeared to twist and writhe, almost as if they were alive. Alex felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as if something was drawing him closer. When he touched the sculpture, he felt a chill run through his body. The moment his fingers made contact, he was overwhelmed by a sudden vision. A dark, swirling vortex filled with haunting, distorted faces. The vision lasted only a few seconds, but left him shaken and disoriented. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Alex began researching the sculpture. He discovered that it had been created by a reclusive artist who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. The artist's journals, which were later found, described the sculpture as a conduit for dark energies and spoke of its ability to trap souls within its twisted forms. That night, Alex began experiencing strange occurrences. He heard whispers in his dorm room, saw fleeting shadows darting past his vision, and felt a persistent sense of being watched. His nightmares became more intense, filled with the same dark vortex he had seen at the gallery. Desperate to escape the torment, Alex returned to the gallery to confront the sculpture. He tried to touch it again, hoping to find some answers, but this time the sculpture seemed to resist him. The shadows grew more violent, and the whispers turned into frantic, desperate cries. In a final attempt to break the curse, Alex organized a ritual to cleanse the sculpture. With the help of a few friends, he performed a ceremony to dispel the dark energies associated with it. As they completed the ritual, the sculpture's twisted forms seemed to calm, and the oppressive atmosphere in the gallery lifted. After the ritual, Alex and his friends noticed that the sculpture was no longer the same. It seemed less menacing, and the disturbing shadows were gone. The gallery staff were puzzled by the change, but were relieved that the unsettling feeling around the sculpture had disappeared. Alex never fully understood what had happened, but he was grateful for the end of the haunting experiences. He continued his studies but avoided the gallery's dark corners, wary of the sculpture's lingering presence. The enigmatic artwork remained a chilling reminder of the unknown forces that can lie hidden in the most unsuspecting places. The Vanishing Lecture. The university's history department was known for its rigorous courses and knowledgeable professors. One of the most revered lecturers was Dr. Jonathan Hale, a historian with a deep passion for ancient civilizations. His lectures were always well attended, and his storytelling captivated students. However, there was one lecture that no one would ever forget, a lecture that seemed to defy the laws of reality. It was a crisp autumn evening when Dr. Hale gave his infamous lecture on a particularly obscure and enigmatic topic, ancient rituals and their purported supernatural effects. The lecture hall was packed, with students eager to hear about the mysterious practices of long-lost cultures. Dr. Hale began with an intriguing discussion about a forgotten ritual involving a gate to the beyond. As he spoke, the lights in the lecture hall flickered intermittently, and a cold draft swept through the room. Some students reported feeling an odd sense of dread, but most attributed it to the spooky nature of the topic. Dr. Hale seemed undeterred, his enthusiasm for the subject growing as he delved deeper into the ancient rituals. Halfway through the lecture, Dr. Hale began discussing a particular ritual that was said to open a gateway to another realm. He mentioned that participants of this ritual could experience moments where they were temporarily transported to a different plane of existence. As he spoke, the room grew colder, and the air seemed to crackle with an eerie energy. Without warning, Dr. Hale suddenly went silent, and the room plunged into darkness. The students were momentarily disoriented, and murmurs of confusion filled the air. When the lights flickered back on, Dr. Hale was nowhere to be seen. His notes and projector had vanished as well. Panic set in as students and faculty searched for Dr. Hale. The lecture hall was thoroughly checked, but there was no sign of him. The authorities were notified, and a campus-wide search was launched. Despite their best efforts, there was no trace of Dr. Hale, and he seemed to have vanished without a clue. In the days following the disappearance, rumors began to spread about what had happened during that fateful lecture. Some students claimed to have seen strange figures moving in the darkness, while others reported hearing whispering voices. There were also accounts of students experiencing vivid dreams about the ancient ritual described by Dr. Hale. Months later, Dr. Hale's disappearance remained an unsolved mystery. The lecture hall was quietly abandoned, and the subject of that lecture was avoided in subsequent classes. Students who had been present that night were left with a sense of unease, haunted by the inexplicable events and the enigmatic nature of the lecture that had seemed to cross into another realm. The Whispering Library. The university's library was a place of knowledge and tranquility, but it held a dark secret within its walls. The library had a basement storage area used for old manuscripts and rarely accessed archives. It was said that the basement was haunted by the spirit of a former librarian who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Clara, a literature student, was working on a research project that required her to access some of the older, less frequently used archives in the basement. She had heard the ghost stories, but was determined to get her work done. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of curiosity, she descended into the basement one evening. The basement was dimly lit, with rows of dusty shelves stretching into the darkness. Clara began her search, moving through the labyrinth of bookshelves and trying to find the manuscripts she needed. The air was cold and stale, and the silence was almost oppressive. As she worked, Clara started to hear faint whispers. At first, she thought they were just echoes or her imagination, but the whispers grew louder and more distinct. The voices seemed to be speaking in a language she couldn't understand, and they appeared to be coming from all directions. She tried to ignore the whispers and continued her research, but the voices grew increasingly insistent. They began to form coherent phrases, pleading and demanding. Clara could make out words like help, lost, and find me. Growing uneasy, Clara decided to investigate the source of the voices. She followed the sound through the maze of shelves until she reached a small, hidden room at the back of the basement. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and Clara hesitated before pushing it open. Inside, she found an old desk with a chair that faced a large, dusty mirror. The mirror's surface was covered in a thick layer of grime, and the room was filled with a strange, almost palpable sense of foreboding. Clara approached the mirror and noticed that it had strange, scratched symbols around its edges. As she examined the mirror, the whispers grew louder, and she felt a cold hand touch her shoulder. She spun around but saw no one. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and her breath fogged up in the icy air. Suddenly, the mirror's surface began to change. The grime seemed to dissipate, revealing a distorted reflection of the basement, one that showed figures moving in the shadows. The reflection also showed a figure standing behind her, a ghostly presence with hollow eyes and an anguished expression. Clara's fear escalated, and she stumbled back, knocking over a stack of old books. The whispers turned into frantic cries, and the room seemed to close in around her. In a panic, Clara fled the basement, leaving her research behind. The next day, Clara reported her experience to the library staff, but they dismissed it as a result of stress and fatigue. She was determined to avoid the basement from then on and completed her project using other resources. The library staff eventually cleaned up the hidden room, but the eerie feeling in the basement remained. Clara's experience became a local legend among students, and the basement was occasionally mentioned in hushed tones. The whispers of the lost librarian continued to haunt the dark corners of the library, a reminder of the mysteries that lay hidden within the university's walls.